11 tonight.
Right, you're on.
I'd like to welcome Rachel, Logan. Welcome.
I didn't do it.
Sorry, I'm pulling up my online.
Your yearbook from back from underneath that thingy.
I'm okay with that.
It's all that walking. I don't need that. But thank you so much.
All right, Romans 11.
No, I'm good.
Gee, Austin.
So Jack,
Last night I was outside, honestly, I was like, that's how you get completely missed the whole thing about come on. I remember that.
All right, here we go.
Sounds like a day.
Action.
Ready or not? Romans 11. Now, before I do Romans 11, some of you have not been here as we've studied through Romans, so tonight might seem a little weird. You might wonder, why is this chapter in the Bible? And so, just as a reminder of a general overview of Romans, Romans is about the gospel, right? In Romans 1, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And so he gives this systematic explanation of what the gospel is and what all it includes. In the first 3 chapters, he spends a lot of time talking about sin and how wicked we are, right? In order to show that there's good news. And the good news is that even though we've sinned and even though we have fallen short of the glory of God, God has made a way for us to be justified or declared right with Him. And how are we justified? How are we saved? By God's grace through what? Faith, right? Not by our works, but through our faith. And by our faith in Jesus, Jesus' death satisfies God's wrath and His justice against sin. And through His resurrection, we are justified, and God declares us right. He goes on later to talk about what that means and what it means to live by faith and why that's important. And then we get to Romans 8, and he goes through this long talk about how nothing can separate us from the love of God. That God's Word never fails. That God never fails. The problem, though, happens in Romans 9. And Romans 9 through 11, which is what we're finishing up tonight, Romans 9 through 11 is this section that deals with one problem. If God never fails, and if His Word never fails, why have the Jewish people not believed the gospel? Why did the Jewish people reject Jesus? Why did the Jewish people crucify Christ? And Paul says in Romans 9 that it wasn't because God failed, but everything happened according to His purpose of election. Romans 10 says that even though God is sovereign in salvation and that He's sovereign in who He chooses to show mercy, He hardens whom He hardens, He mercies whom He mercies, we still have the responsibility to share the gospel with the world. Now Romans 11, which is where we are and where we kind of got halfway last week, Romans 11 deals with why has Israel rejected the gospel? And what in the world does that even have to do with all of us in here? What does it matter to us if the Jews reject the gospel? It has everything to do with it. If you'll look back on the first page, and if you don't have the notes from last week, we're not going to go over that first page there, Romans 11, 1 through 24. But just as a reminder, remember, many of the Jews have trusted in Jesus, and yet most of them have rejected Jesus. And so this first argument Paul makes in Romans 11, 1 through 10, which we're not going to look at tonight, we've already studied that. Paul says that there is still a remnant of Israelites who are being saved. Paul says, even though it looks like all the Jewish people have rejected Jesus, there's still a few that are believing the gospel. And yet, we ended last week with the fact that most of Israel is blinded to the truth, right? Most of them still to this day reject Jesus as the Messiah. And Paul's going to caution us tonight. Don't be arrogant and don't be proud and say, well, I'm not like the Jewish people. I believe in Jesus. How can they not see Jesus as the Messiah? Because Romans 11, last week, we see that God is hardening them for a purpose. God has made their ears deaf. He's made their eyes blind. He's made their hearts hard for a season so that they reject Jesus. And if that sounds harsh, remember Romans 9 says that God's the potter, we're the clay, and He has freedom to do so. And yet He has a purpose. And that's where we're going to pick up in Romans 11, starting in verse 11. Hopefully that catches you up and kind of reminds you of where we've been. And so, I'm going to read tonight verses 11 to 24. We'll finish out this section, and then we'll go to the next page that I gave you, which is what we were going to study for tonight. Okay, so we'll do 2 pages. Okay, the back of the first page, and then the front of the second page. All right. So here we go. Romans 11, verse 11. All right. Anybody need a Bible? I forgot to ask. Anybody need one? I got plenty of extras. Need one? Yeah. Let me go get one real quick.
Thank you.
Yep.
I was really hoping you get stuck in the gate so I could be like, squeeze the buttons together, slide it back, push up.
Thank you.
Shorten his trip.
Okay. Yep.
Do you have a Bible?
Yep.
Do you have a Bible?
Does anybody else need the notes from last week?
Practice on here.
Anybody else? Good? All right. Okay. Romans 11. Verse 11. Everybody got it? Everybody ready? Romans 11, verse 11.
Let's do this.
Paul says, so I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? Who is they? Who's he talking about? The Jews. Did the Jews stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass or through their unbelief, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. That is a crucial verse of what's going on in this whole chapter. Let me read that again. Rather, through Israel's trespass, in other words, through their unbelief and refusal to believe the gospel, salvation has come to the Gentiles, that's all of us, so as to make Israel jealous. Verse 12. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Verse 13. Now I am speaking to you Gentiles, that's us. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as firstfruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. All right, let's stop there and look at some of these verses and see what Paul's saying. All right. If you're new, following along in the notes, and there's blanks to fill in to kind of help you follow along as we go. All right, so here we go. Verse 11. God planned Israel's rejection to open the way for Gentiles to be saved. Now, when you hear Gentiles, think all of you. Okay? God allowed and planned the Jewish people to reject Jesus so that salvation and the gospel would be available to you. Okay? And Paul's point here is that the nation of Israel's rejection is not final, only temporary. Right? That's the first blank. It's only temporary. Verse 11 says, "So I ask, did the Jews stumble in order that they might fall?" That is, fall completely. And he says, "By no means. Rather, it was through their trespass, salvation came to the Gentiles to make the Jews jealous." By offering salvation to the Gentiles, God intends to make Israel jealous. So, what does that mean? It means, next, God has planned the salvation of the Gentiles. God planned to save us. And just to remind you, God was not obligated to do so. Have you ever thought about this? God could have left us in our sin. He could have left you in your rebellion. He could have allowed you to go your own way and to do your own thing and allow you to go to hell, and He would have been fully justified in doing so. Don't forget that. He was not obligated to save us, and yet He's merciful. And so He has temporarily allowed the rejection of the Jews to open a way of salvation for us, and that is incredibly gracious. God planned the salvation of the Gentiles, and God has promised the future restoration of the Jews. He promises that the Jews will be restored again. So let's look at Ezekiel 39, verse 29. And Megan, you might have to skip a little bit because this is last week's PowerPoint. Go to the Ezekiel passage right there. Okay? Someone read Ezekiel 39, verse 29.
"And I will not hide my face any more from them when I pour out my Spirit upon the house of Israel, declares the Lord God."
Ezekiel prophesies that there will be a day when God will no longer hide Himself from the Jewish people, and they will believe the gospel. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to believe. Okay? He's going to pour His Spirit out on the Jewish people. Now, let's look at verse 12 again. Verse 12. "Now, if their trespass," that is, if the Jewish people's unbelief, "means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean?" Okay? You get his argument? He's saying, look what happened when the Jews rejected Jesus. What was the result? What was the result of the Jews rejecting Jesus?
The Gentiles were given.
We get the gospel, right? Yeah, we get salvation. So if that's true about when they rejected Jesus, think about all the blessings that are going to come when they actually receive Jesus. That's what he's saying in verse 12. Right? If Israel's fall led to great riches for Gentiles, Israel's restoration will bring even greater blessings. The day is coming when the Jews who are alive will turn in faith to follow Jesus as the Messiah. When he says full inclusion, if Israel's sin, remember the Jews, if they sinned by rejecting Jesus, if that brought salvation to the Gentiles, then the blessing will be even greater when all of Israel is saved. Okay? Now let's look at verse 13. Do y'all understand the argument he's making so far? Okay. This is kind of weird argumentation. This probably isn't a Bible study you do a lot. Like your small group, you probably didn't do this in VBS or anything. Like this wasn't the topic. But there's important stuff here, right? Look at verse 13 again. He says, "Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them." Okay? So, back to your notes. Paul seeks to make his kinsmen, his Jewish kinsmen, jealous by his ministry to the Gentiles. So he looks at the Jewish people, and for a while, where was the first place, after Paul became a Christian, where was the first place that he went to preach?
Antioch?
No. I'm not thinking so much of a city as a general place. Where would he go?
The first place he went was Jerusalem.
Like
no,
the
it wasn't. It was
synagogues.
the synagogues.
He would go to the synagogues.
Yeah.
Why would he go to the synagogues? Who were in the synagogues?
The Jewish people.
The Jewish people. So who did he go to first? He went to the Jews. That's who Paul went to. When you read the book of Acts, he becomes a Christian, And you're right, he went to Jerusalem. He went to all these places and he started going to the synagogues to try to convince them first that Jesus was the Messiah. And some of them, a few of them, believed. But what did most of them do? Rejected. They didn't only reject Jesus, what did they do to Paul? They stoned him, they beat him, they followed him, they falsely accused him, they threw him into prison. He had a rough time with the Jewish people. So what does he do? Instead of continuing to preach to the Jews, he says, fine, you don't want this? I'll go to the Gentiles because they're willing to hear it. And so he starts to preach and he becomes an apostle to the Gentiles. Have you ever done that with little kids? You do something to, like one little kid doesn't want to play. And so what do? Is you go find some other kid and you say, hey, you want to play with my ball? And what does the other kid want to do? Well, I want to play. They want in all of a sudden, right? So you're creating jealousy by rejecting one to go to the other. What'd you say, Amy?
I said that never happened to me.
That never happened to you?
No.
Are you being sarcastic?
No.
No? Did that happen to anybody else? It happened to me.
Yeah.
I do it with kids when I babysit. If they don't want to eat a certain food, I'll give it to the other one, and then that creates, because they don't want the other person to eat it, they'll want to eat it.
Exactly. And so that's kind of what Paul's doing here. In order to create jealousy, he says, fine, you don't want this? I'll go to someone else who does want it. And so he starts to preach to the Gentiles. Okay? Paul magnifies his ministry so that many Gentiles will be saved. But his hope is that when the Gentiles believe the gospel, the Jews are going to become jealous and be saved too. Right? You see him say that in verse 13 and 14? Verse 14, I do that in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. So let me ask you a question. This is in your notes. Here's your question. Deep question to think about tonight. Are we, or let me be a little more specific, are you making people jealous of your own relationship with God? Are you making other people jealous about your own relationship with God? Are you so devoted, so passionate, so zealous, so filled with the Spirit? Are you so devoted to Jesus that other people look at you and say, man, I want what she has. I want what he has. I want to live like that. I don't want to be half-hearted. I don't want to just go through the motions. I want to be like that. Are you making people jealous with the way you live your life for Christ? Another question. Do people desire Christ when they see how valuable he is to you? Do people desire Christ when they see how valuable he is to you? Or what a treasure he is to you? That's a good question to ask all of us, right? Am I living my life in a way that people want to be Christian? That doesn't mean that you're just overly sweet and just so nice that it makes people sick. It means you're real. You know, like authentic. Like you're not playing a game. You're like, he's for real. She's for real. Well, she screws up. She says stuff she shouldn't say, but man, I want to be like her. I want to be like him. Are we living our lives that way? That's what Paul desired for these Jewish people. And so next in our notes, what happened? Verse 15. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So here in your notes, Paul says that Israel's, first blank, rejection, this is straight from verse 15, Israel's rejection brought reconciliation to the nations. What were you guessing?
I was guessing life. She was guessing salvation.
I told you it's in verse 15. Their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. You see that, verse 15? When Israel rejects Jesus, it means that we are reconciled to God. God makes peace with us. This is also from verse 15. Israel's future acceptance will result in Israel's awakening. Israel's future acceptance of Christ will result in their awakening. Any questions so far? Comments? Something you... Who's here?
Question.
Yes.
I was just thinking in my head, like, reading this and how, like, trying to think of maybe a question that somebody might, a non-believer might bring up, like, how, I don't like the whole, we're not put on this earth to question God because, yet again, He's the potter and He has the right to do whatever He wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that I'm thinking, like, how, like, is it fair, I guess you could say? Like, the Jews and how, even though He's hardened them, and they're probably going to go through their whole entire life not believing that, you know, Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and how, you know, the Jews, at some point, they're going to get a second chance to be redeemed, and then, but I'm like, the Gentiles won't, if you understand what I'm saying.
What do you
Like,
mean they won't?
Like, in the sense that the Jews, even though right now we know they don't believe, we know that at some point it's going to be a conclude point where their eyes will be open and they're going to truly believe, reconciling them, bringing them back to Christ. And inform that no matter what they do now, God's already had a plan for them that you will see me. And how, like, I was thinking in my head, like, how does that play to, well, the Gentiles that even though them not believing is, we're seeing God, it's, I guess not saying, like, people will kind of say it's kind of not fair that even though the Jews will still get a second chance, in a sense.
I understand your question. The order, I think you got order reversed. And here's what I mean. Tell me if this doesn't make sense. What's going to happen to Israel in the future is happening to the nations right now. People all over the world are believing the gospel. There's people in China right now in underground churches bigger than any church you've ever seen in America, and they don't have a building. They're in an underground, and they're meeting under the oppression of a communist government, and they're believing the gospel. Anybody know where the gospel's spreading the fastest right now?
The Muslim world.
It's spreading there. It is the Muslim world. Which continent?
Asia.
Asia's spreading fast. There's another one too. I would say these two actually. Asia and Africa.
Oh, yeah.
Y'all, what God did in the 1700s in America with this Great Awakening, that's going on in Africa right now. There are millions of people who are believing the gospel. And so God's doing this incredible work in Africa, and it looks as if He is starting to move away from America by the way that our country makes its moral decisions. The courts of the Supreme Court, the decisions that they're making, that they're handing down, all the policies that our Congress and Senate make, all of these things is just a sign of God's judgment. Are you okay?
I had to scratch him with my
Mama. He's having a rough night.
He's upset too about the way our country.
He's very upset about our nation right now. And so, yeah. And so it looks like the Spirit of God is moving in Africa. So my point is, it's not that the Gentiles are getting a second chance or the Jews are getting a second chance. God's going to do for the Jews what He's never done before. The Jews have never had an awakening to Jesus. This is going to be their first awakening. Some of them believed, but not many. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's your question? Any other questions? How many of you are hearing this stuff for the first time? Like you've never even thought about this stuff before? Anybody? This is new? That's okay. It's new. It's good. It's in the Bible, right? You need to study full counsel of the Word of God, and this has implications for you and me. Look at verse 16. Verse 16. Paul starts talking about dough. If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Okay? Verse 16. This is in your notes. The promises made to the Jewish patriarchs are the foundation of God's salvation. Who are the Jewish patriarchs? What do I mean by that? Who are we talking about? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what did God tell Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He would make a great nation out of them, and all the nations out of Abraham would be blessed. Well, this is how it's happening. All the nations are blessed through the gospel. And yet, the first fruit, because the first fruit offering, and this is in Numbers, and I don't even know if we're going to look at this or not, because the first fruit offering represented the entire portion, the entire piece of dough was considered holy. He's using Old Testament law language. So when an Israelite was going to the temple to make a sacrifice, and they were going to give their bread, and they would give part of their bread to the temple, it was a symbol that their bread, the small portion they gave, they understood that all of their bread was God's. And they're giving part of it as an offering, but they understood all of it was His. Same way when you go to church and you give money and you tithe. If you tithe and say you give 10%, that 10% is not just you doing your duty and saying, here church, here's my money, go do ministry. You're giving that money so that you're showing, I'm not just giving God 10% of my money, I'm giving Him 10% to show that I trust Him with the 90% I have left. I give Him money to show Him that all my money is His money. And I prove that by giving a portion of it straight to Him. Before I pay my taxes, before I pay my bills, before I pay for my food, before I go out and have fun, my money goes straight to the Lord because it's His. All of it's His. And I'm a steward of the way that I use it. Okay? And so the way He's talking here, when He says the dough, when you give the offering of the dough, all the bread is the Lord's. Okay? So, then He gives this verse about the tree. Look at verse 16 again. He says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. In the Old Testament, Israel is described as an olive tree. Okay? Do we have Jeremiah 11? That was the Numbers passage. I'm skipping that. Someone read Jeremiah 11, verse 16.
The Lord once called you a green olive tree, beautiful with good fruit. But with the roar of a great tempest, He will set fire to it, and its branches will be consumed. This was prophecy that God was going to judge Israel. And when the tree burns, He's talking about the nation of Israel. God's going to judge them. Okay? Hosea 14, verses 6 and 7. Someone read that.
His shoots shall spread out. His beauty shall be like the olive, and His fragrance like Lebanon. They shall return and dwell beneath my shadow. They shall flourish like the grain. They shall blossom like the vine. Their fame shall be like the lion of Lebanon.
In the first verse in Jeremiah, God was judging the olive tree, and it was burning. But what's happening to the tree now? It's growing, right? It's flourishing, and God's going to make it flourish again. Now, why is He using this language, this metaphor of a root and branches? The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are the root. Okay, that's the next blank. They're the root. I know, he's distracting.
They just put him up on a pedestal. That'll make him less distracting.
Can you sit with me?
Is that roots or root?
Root. They are the root of Israel. So where did the tree, this olive tree of Israel, come from? It comes from the root. And who did it start with? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, see how that works? So now Abraham's physical descendants are the branches. Or the branches. And so because God accepted Abraham in the beginning, and He made a covenant with Abraham, that means He's going to be faithful to the children of Abraham. All right? Now let's read. Do some more reading. Somebody read. Somebody read verses 17 to 24.
But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did